Hey, what's up, everybody? I hope that you're doing well and ready to get started. Although I know that many of you maybe have been dealing with power issues and power outages. So it's a real bummer. I remember when I lived in Riverside, they had to shut the power grid off all the time because the wildfires were always so bad. They would threaten like the city. It's been a tough year, tough several months for California. So, rest easy, stay home. Although I saw that Governor Newsom lifted orders on limiting businesses. I guess you can go where you want now, but be careful because the ICUs are already at capacity. Anyway, if COVID doesn't get you, maybe the weather will. Seriously though, I'm really happy that you're here. I hope that you're in good health and that you're ready to get started. We're going to address economic voting today. And what I have in mind is we will discuss economic voting and what it is and some of the different types. We'll see some examples from different contexts. And then on Friday, what I think we'll do is we can talk about methods. We can talk about how the Harding article is set up and what kinds of methods were used there. And I think ultimately what I want to discuss on Friday is how useful the comparative method can be when considering the different circumstances under which economic voting becomes important. And we'll talk about what that means and how we'll get at that later on in this discussion tonight. Now, if you're just joining us or if you've been here already, maybe you noticed that I shared the slides in the chat. Several students had asked if I could share them ahead of time so that you can take notes in real time. I got to thinking about it and I realized that that might be useful. And so I went ahead and I'm going to try to share them with you. Keep in mind that we might not get through all of them, but if you're a student who wants access to them up front, there they are. Now, if you're just joining us and you don't see that in the chat, it's possible that you had to be here at the moment when I shared it. But if you do want those, maybe just go in the chat and comment and ask someone to share them again with you, because here in a moment, I'm going to get started with the lecture and I won't necessarily be able to come back and take care of that. But I do want you to have access to them if that's something that would be useful to you. Yeah, so I take it that you have to be here when I share it. And I'm kind of figuring that out as I go. So I'm going to share them again. I'm sharing them right now. It might take a moment because it's sort of a big file, but it should be in the chat here in just a minute or two. Okay, Hargis, and others who might be looking for that. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. I think that it now is as good a time as ever for us to embark. So in this class, you've noticed already that we're organizing the content in terms of a series of outcomes. We are focusing on variables. We are focusing on ways of thinking about this issue methodologically and systematically. So it makes sense for us to organize the material in this way. In the first outcome is voting behavior. And this is maybe the one that is the most important and the most widely addressed in the literature, because voting is, after all, the most fundamental democratic act. Both voters and parties engage in this behavior in an organized institutional context. And the question for us is what shapes voters' attitudes and behavior? And what is really at the root of their decision making? Is it partisanship or economic circumstances? Is it considerations of ethnicity or cultural beliefs or other circumstances that might connect them to a party or a candidate? Similarly, what shapes the strength of parties in voters' minds? What explains their attachment to a party or their lack thereof? What causes transformations in what partisanship means to voters or in parties' demographic bases? Why is it that whole groups of people will sort of abandon a party or a set of parties in favor of an alternative? or in favor of an individual, and so on. What causes a collapse in popular support for system sustaining political parties? Why is it that in Peru and Venezuela, the party systems collapsed in the 1990s? Why is it that in other countries in Latin America, the party systems were maintained and maintained the support of voters? Why is it that voters are more or less approved of by voters? What explains the attachment to parties or the lack thereof? In the big picture, the point that I want to stress to you before we continue is that when we do this, we are engaging in an analytical academic exercise, but we're also getting at something that has profound implications for democratic accountability in the capacity of voters to punish or reward politicians and parties. Voting behavior matters a great deal because if it's true, if we do find that voters are informed and calculating and strategic, that means that they should be capable of punishing and rewarding bad and good politicians. But if they're uninformed, if their behavior is erratic and unsystematic, they may be far less capable of holding these leaders and these parties accountable. So we care about this a great deal. And this brings us to our first type of voting, or our first theoretical unit, our first unit on what might drive the vote and what might explain the vote. And when we talk about economic voting, and when we talk about considerations of economic conditions, either individual conditions or economy wide, we often think of and remember this old saying, it's the economy, stupid. Story goes that James Carville, who was a controversial character to say the least, when he was working in the Clinton administration, the first Clinton administration, he put this up on the whiteboard in the West Wing. He wrote, "The economy, stupid." And legend has it that this is where this idea or this saying originated. Now, to be clear, political scientists, we've been studying economic voting for like a half a century. So Carville wasn't the first one to come up with the idea that voters vote based on assessments of economic circumstances. But he captured the logic of that very neatly with this pithy statement, the economy, stupid. This is what shapes decision making and voter behavior. Administrations and parties will live or die based upon the economic circumstances over which they preside, because those circumstances will shape the way that voters behave in the next election. So this is sort of the starting point, because this is something that virtually all of us have maybe heard or seen somewhere, and this is the story and the way it goes. If we get into this on a more academic level, we would define economic voting in the following way. The economic vote is the importance that the voter gives to economic performance in their decision to vote for a political party. And the economic vote is, well, first and foremost, it's a robust finding. There's a great deal of empirical support for this claim that voters decide based upon economic considerations. And it's also something that is very neat and tidy and consistent with rational choice perspectives. And because of this, both the robustness of the finding and the intuitiveness of the logic, this is something that scholars agree on a great deal. There's a lot of discussion and controversy in comparative political behavior, but this is one area where there's a lot of agreement about some of the basics. The idea that economic vote is a real thing and that voters decide based on these considerations. And so Norpoth in 1996 put it this way. He said, "How universal is economic voting? Voting that way is hardwired into the brains of citizens in democracies." And indeed, there's a substantial body of evidence from the United States, as well as from France. There are mixed results in some studies on Nordic states and other European countries, but In particular, advanced democracies seem to exhibit this pattern where economic considerations often will motivate or drive voting behavior. But it's also the case that developing countries exhibit this pattern too. And so here's a headline on the most recent elections in South Africa from 2019, where the biggest issues were corruption and jobs or employment. This is, an example of economic voting. It appears as though, according to the surveys and the information that was available at this time, the most important issues in voters' heads in South Africa were corruption and jobs. That is, reducing corruption and in creating jobs. And so this is economic voting, if ever there was an example of it. And there are examples from other places in the developing world that are noteworthy too. And one of those is the example of India. India is the world's largest democracy, but it's interesting because it is a less developed economy in a place where economic considerations are going to be different than they might be in a place like France or Germany or Norway, or even South Africa for that matter. But what's remarkable is the consistency of the pattern in the way in which economic considerations seem to drive voter behavior in all of these different circumstances. And so we're going to use this as an example. Before we watch this video, I'm going to take a look at the chat and see what contributions we have here. Okay, it appears that maybe the download has been especially slow, or the upload has been especially slow for some of you. Uh, okay, I'll figure out what to do. The challenge is that it takes a long time to upload them anywhere. It takes a long time to upload them to CAT courses too, because it's a large file. There's some information and some video in here. And so this has always been one of the challenges, sharing the slides. It just takes time to upload them. And so I may have to reconsider the practice. I'm going to do my best to accommodate you, but if it takes a long time to upload the slides, we might not be able to do this as planned. So Martin is asking, in what way does anti-corruption worries connect to economic voting? It doesn't, but jobs does. If jobs and jobs considerations are the most are one of the most important issues, well, that certainly does connect to economic voting. But corruption doesn't necessarily. Corruption relates more to governance and accountability. But let's watch this video.
Over the last 6 weeks, more than 600 million Indians voted in the country's national election, a record for the world's largest democracy. Exit polls show Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his party, the BJP, are on track to dominate India for another 5 years. If Modi ends up winning, he can thank supporters like Ankit Vadva, who's seen his fortune rise with India's growing middle class.
Business are doing nice. We are getting a good profit. And this 5 years was like going towards a gold biscuit. India is growing.
Vadva's opened his third business, a wedding venue, and credits Modi for simplifying the tax code and for untangling India's infamous bureaucracy.
This is the entry, which will be decorated. तो वहाँ पे सारा in-house proper आपका जो main course है वो वहाँ पर आएगा. And one more venue we have is a poolside venue. I'll show that also. Where India stands in the world, you can ask anyone, not from us. Now, yes, just because of Modi ji.
Yeah.
Yes,
and
just because of Modi. That's good. He's going great, and no one will stop him this time also. He's coming as a prime minister again very soon.
So you see real virtue in Modi.
He's a virtuous person, right? He's a virtuous person, and he's becoming a brand. He's becoming a brand like anything in India. So definitely, all are happy and all are enjoying.
Do you think I should move back to India?
Definitely, this is a golden time to come back.
When Modi ran for his first term, He played up his hardscrabble childhood selling tea on trains and promised to bring Acche Din, or good days, to all by creating 10 million new jobs a year. Under Modi, India has jumped over China to become the fastest growing major economy. But that growth has mostly helped people who already have jobs and offices. Workers overall are facing the worst job market in 45 years.
मोदी सरकार की ऐसी नीति मिली तो किसानों का जो जीवन स्तर आज से 5 साल पहले था.
It's made Pratap Singh's master's in political science practically worthless, and he paid a fifth of the value of his family farm to get it.
मोदी जी ने वादा करा था, उसके मुद्दे पे हमने पिछले बार मोदी जी को वोट दिया था, लेकिन ना तो रोजगार की बात हुई. अब हम किसान के पुत्र हैं ना या खेती में कुछ कर पा रहे हैं. जैसे वर्तमान परिस्थिति में यहाँ 15 लाख रुपए एकड़ जमीन के भाव हुआ करते थे, वर्तमान कंडीशन में 5 लाख रुपए एकड़ जमीन के भाव.
Who are you going to vote for this election?
कांग्रेस को वोट देना पसंद करूंगा.
Why would you vote for a party like Congress that has had so many scandals?
जो भी भ्रष्टाचार होता है उनको खुद उजागर करने का काम कांग्रेस पार्टी ने किया. जिनने भ्रष्टाचार करा उनको दंड देने का काम कांग्रेस ने करा. लेकिन मोदी सरकार में जहां अपन तुलना करेंगे तो एक बहुत बड़ा घोटाला तो हमारे ही प्रदेश में हुआ व्यापम का, तो उनको वहीं पे दबाने का काम किया जा रहा है. उजागर वो हो ही नहीं पाते हैं. बाकी कांग्रेस जो है वो लोकतांत्रिक पार्टी जो भी है साफ है उसके सामने, देश के सामने.
For a while, it seemed like farmer discontent would put Congress back in power. But on February 14th, a suicide bomber killed 44 Indian soldiers in Kashmir. A terror group in Muslim-majority Pakistan claimed responsibility, and Modi bombed what he said was a terrorist camp in Pakistani territory.
मैं आतंकी संगठनों को और उनके सरपरस्तों को कहना चाहता हूं कि वे बहुत बड़ी गलती कर चुके हैं.
With two nuclear powers rattling sabers, economic concerns hit the back pages, and Modi fulfilled his promise never to back down to India's regional rival. Tensions eased, but not before Modi scored major points, even beyond his Hindu nationalist base, branding himself as India's chowkidar, or guardian. Tej Bahadur Yadav was once himself a soldier in Kashmir. He's not convinced by Modi's tough guy posturing, and he launched a long-shot bid to unseat the PM from his district.
हमारे हिंदुस्तान को बचाना है, देश को बचाना है, तो मोदी को वोट नहीं करना है. ये हम पब्लिक से अपील कर रहे हैं सभी लोग.
Modi चौकीदार है?
नो, मोदी नो चौकीदार. मोदी जी नकली चौकीदार. हम असली चौकीदार जो देश की सुरक्षा करता है वो असली चौकीदार. मोदी नकली चौकीदार.
Yadav claims to have the support of 50,000 service members, but the election commission struck him from the ballot for a technicality.
सिर्फ तानाशाही तरीके से ही बनारस में अगर भी मेरा पर्चा खारिज नहीं किया जाता तो मैं एक आम सिपाही गरीब घर का लड़का उसको यहाँ से चुनाव हरा के भेजता. लेकिन वो तानाशाही तरीके से सब दिखा रहा है. हमारे इंडिया की जितनी मीडिया है उसको ज्यादातर उसने खरीदा हुआ है.
At first, there was a lot of discontent, it seemed, over the economy because unemployment was so high, specifically youth unemployment. But then the narrative kind of changed after the attacks in Pakistan.
ब्रेन वॉश किया जाता है हमारे यहाँ पर. तो खासकर हिंदू खतरे में नहीं है. जितने भी हमले, जितने भी चीजें होती हैं सिर्फ चुनाव के टाइम पे याद किया जाता है, और चुनाव के बाद ना तो कोई जवान को याद करता है, ना किसान को, ना मजदूर को. यही हमारा देश का दुर्भाग्य है.
This brainwashing has taken on monumental proportions.
I am very excited to visit for the first time. We are comparing right now with Statue of Liberty.
Modi commissioned the statue, the world's tallest, to rewrite Hindu nationalism into India's history. It doesn't show a typical hero like peace-loving Gandhi. Who's the statue of?
Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, Iron Man.
Sardar Patel was a founding father who got that nickname for using force to try and unify the country. A useful narrative for the BJP, even if Patel never wanted a Hindu nationalist state.
It's crazy ना कि कुछ तो देखें कि हमारे इंडिया में भी तो डेवलपमेंट हो रहा है.
Symbols like this help Modi's supporters look past what he hasn't delivered and favor what he's promising. How does it make you feel?
Proud. Obviously proud.
Which could keep Modi in power for a long time to come. I like your kurta. It's white.
ये मोदी की देन है. White. सफेद मतलब कोई गंदगी नहीं होती. वो हिसाब है नरेंद्र मोदी की सरकार बनेगी, कोई रोकने वाला नहीं है.
So there are many issues here in this video, and there are more layers than appear at first glance. So the policies have been beneficial for the middle class and for business owners. Joblessness and job creation haven't been very robust. I guess I should say joblessness has been higher and job creation has been relatively low in India. And so youth and more unskilled workers haven't been very supportive of Modi. What was interesting about the video was it showed that despite a poor economy for the vast majority of Indians, the security situation and the event around the uprising in the government's response helped to sort of bolster Modi's administration ahead of the election. And so then it raises the question, under some circumstances, does economic voting become less important when there are security considerations or when there are law and order considerations or what are perceived to be? And so this is one issue that comes up in the literature. When does economic voting matter and when doesn't it matter? And when will the economic vote become relevant and when will it be less relevant? And what I'd like to suggest to you and what we'll begin to get into on Friday is there's an important role for comparative methods in determining under what circumstances economic voting becomes important and when it's less important. And we can use comparisons of a few cases that are very similar in a lot of respects to try to tease out when economic voting becomes more salient and when it is less salient. And so one possible hypothesis is that when there is a security threat or when there is some sort of internal security or other disturbance, it creates an opportunity for the government to shore up its control and maybe bolster its image and gain credibility ahead of the election, even if the economy is performing poorly. So maybe a security threat helps to diffuse economic voting. That's one hypothesis that we could test if we wanted to look into this in different circumstances. So yeah, so certainly India is a controversial political system, and like many others, it appears to be in decline from the vantage point of democracy. And I'm aware of that, but I think for our purposes, it's useful to simply just assess the motivations of voters, right? Kind of regardless of the strength of the democracy, these voters or these actors still appear to be motivated primarily by either economic or security considerations. And so that's what's interesting for us and what we can study, what we can use this for. But I do agree that the Hindu nationalism is a disturbing feature. It does undermine the democratic credentials, especially if we're thinking in terms of equality and solidarity. So, okay, let's move forward. And I'm well aware that Modi is a controversial and that's putting it lightly, right? We could argue easily that he's an authoritarian figure and a sort of nationalist who's got a very narrow definition of nationalism, and that doesn't usually sit well with democracy if we think of democracy as about toleration and solidarity and inclusiveness and equality, which are the values that are the civic virtues or the civic cultural values outlined by Almond and Verba, which we'll discuss later in this semester. Now, economic voting did ultimately or originally develop in the United States and out of observations about US voting. And in the United States, economic voting has been especially important because of, well, the growth of the economy and in the United States' role in the world economy. And so people have always been concerned about the economy from the very beginning. It seems like since they started studying this years and years and years ago. And here's an example of just the most recent election, the 2020 presidential and legislative elections and other elections. The Pew Research Center found that the most important issue for voters in that election was the economy. And next was healthcare, Supreme Court appointments, and so on and so forth. And the economy took the lead by a relatively large measure. It wasn't even close. And most elections seem to show this pattern, although not all of them do. And what's interesting is to think about how we could compare elections. We could find an election where the economy was a less important issue, and we could compare elections where it was more important and try to figure out, well, what was going on during those elections when it was more important? Was there an economic recession at that time? Was there a slowdown that was affecting people in a particularly significant way? Is it possible that the economy is perceived as less important and economic voting falls in importance when there's more economic growth and people aren't thinking consciously about the potential for disaster? Maybe in those situations they think more about other types of issues. And so maybe the economic situation at the time influences the importance of economic voting in that given election. I don't think anyone would dispute that this election was one that took place during an economic recession, and a sustained one at that, that has many of us in very difficult circumstances. And so understandably, the economy would be important at this time. But, was it equally important in, say, 1996, when the economy was growing at a robust rate? Perhaps if you look at those issue voting numbers, you'll find that the economy was less of a motivator, less of a factor in that election. I don't know, just a consideration. Let's watch one more video because it's so useful. This is from the US context, but it's so special because we hear from union leaders, we hear from workers, we hear from a variety of different stakeholders, some of whom have conflicting interests and some of whom have sort of conflicting loyalties. This shows the power of the economic vote and sort of the extent to which people will vote based on economic considerations, despite some of their associations or how we might expect them to vote based on other factors. So let's watch this and pay close attention to the different motivations of the actors.
Dan Russell lives an hour outside of Pittsburgh, where he doesn't drink the water from his tap.
Here it is in the water after they hosed it off. You can still see the shit floating around. That's just one of the spills.
When fracking started here 6 years ago, Russell's life changed.
That was on the well site, so they tried to hide it with the sand.
Where's the closest frack pad to your property?
1,000 yards that way.
How does that impact your life?
So we dealt with the light, we dealt with the noise. The grids in my windows actually would vibrate during drilling.
Have you had negative health impacts due to the fracking?
Early on, when they were drilling, we had a lot of issues. The odors. I mean, we had some nosebleeds early on. I think it was drying us out, or I don't know what was going on. We had DEP here quite a bit with no help. I feel like I've been fucking violated. That's how I feel. This is bullshit. This is supposed to be America. And you can't get help even from the people that's supposed to be helping you, that we pay in our township or in our government, that's supposed to be overseeing these people, and nothing happens.
Obviously, this has had a huge impact on your life and your property and your home. What would it take for you to feel safe living here and for your home and your property to be a place you want to live?
I don't want to live here. I'd rather get out of here. I mean, to be honest with you, anymore, I live on memories because I was born and raised out here. But the area is so divided now since the industry moved in. It's just so divided. I mean, neighbors that used to talk and get along with each other don't, because of the industry being either you're for it or against it.
Fracking is the process of breaking up rock to extract pockets of natural gas. It's been sold as the answer to the US energy crisis and also linked to environmental damage. Pennsylvania has one of the largest natural gas reserves in the country. It covers about 2/3 of the state.
This is kind of new to Pennsylvania, and I'm not all totally against it, but let's at least regulate it. Let's talk about the messes that we're making. Let's clean it. Let's do this right. Let's do this right. I worked construction union my whole life. I have a lot of friends that benefited from gas industry, okay? But the regulations need to be changed drastically for the little people here too. What are we leaving our kids?
About half of Pennsylvanians support fracking in their state, including 25% of Democrats. Both presidential candidates support it too, at least for now.
I'll keep you jobs in Pennsylvania where they belong, and you're going to be doing fracking for a long time.
Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden, on the other hand, wants to phase out fracking long term.
Well, fracking has to continue because we need a transition. We're going to get to net zero emissions by 2050, and we'll get to net zero power emissions by 2035.
Officials in the small town of Braddock don't think that answer goes far enough.
I like him to address environmental issues head on. Right now, he's on both sides of the fence, and I'm like, you got to make a decision here.
What do you mean he's on both sides of the fence right now?
By saying I want fracking to continue, but I don't want more of them to happen. He's on both sides of the fence because you can't be against the problem and contribute to the problem too. That's not a solution.
Natural gas extraction poses a new threat from the nearby U.S. steel mill that wants to start fracking on their property. Do you have any purview as the mayor of Braddock to tell the steel mill that you don't want to see fracking around here?
I could tell them that I don't want to see fracking, but they don't have to take my word for it. When every time I say that I think fracking is a bad idea, they say if we can't frack, we're going to have to lay some people off.
What is your response when they say that?
I think that sounds like ransom.
Sorry, just to be clear, why don't you have any authority over that?
Braddock is a municipality and it is a weak mayor system. I can make recommendations, cut ribbons. I oversee the police department, but I don't have a vote on things once they come out to council to vote on. I can break ties, but I don't get to really make any decisions. I can just recommend things until my face turns blue.
Do you see any benefits to fracking and to having the steel mill in your town?
The steel mill, they pay us taxes. The benefit to fracking, there is no benefit to fracking.
It's not yet clear how fracking will impact the presidential election in Pennsylvania, but Biden's position isn't popular among union workers who rely on oil and gas companies for jobs. One of them is Sean Steffi, an organizer for the Boilermakers Union Local 154, and a loyal Democratic voter, at least until Trump's 2016 campaign. Your local union here endorses President Trump.
Yep.
Why?
Pennsylvania is energy driven. We are the leader of electricity generation. We have great resources with gas and coal, and we need to see that move forward. And our beliefs and our feelings that President Trump can move this industry forward. And I don't think the Biden and Harris administration has anything that they want to move forward in fossil fuel industry. So that alone drives us.
How has his administration in the past 3.5 years impacted you all here in Pittsburgh?
Well, he has dropped some regulations on air and water and, the fracking, and that has pushed the industry forward.
How do you see fracking playing into this presidential election?
It's going to be huge in the state of Pennsylvania, okay? Fracking, coal, electricity generation, and just fossil fuels in general drives Pennsylvania. Okay, the jobs are here. Great blue collar family sustaining jobs have been made possible by the fossil fuel industry.
What's the top voting issue for you in November?
Economy, jobs, and the fossil fuel industry. Listen, we're backing a Republican. I understand. There may be union issues. I mean, I'm 100% union. I believe in all the rights of unions. But the bottom line is if I don't have a job, I can't fight for anything.
And there you have it. That appears to be the logic of the economic vote. If I don't have a job, I can't fight for anything. And it's that material consideration, that assessment of one's situation and their capacity in whether they could do anything in life. Think about it. You always need an income, right? And so the economic vote taps into this fundamental trigger, this rational calculus that we have where we assess circumstances and we decide how to vote based on how well we'll do with the incumbent government or an alternative. And in this case, it was interesting to see a union leader supportive of the Republican candidate sort of resisting many of these expectations about how union leaders should behave and showing support for the Republican based on what is clearly an economic consideration. And so this is how economic voting works. But we can distinguish between a few different types of economic voting. And so far in the discussion, these haven't been necessarily clear, although we've seen examples of all of these different types so far. So pocketbook voting is when you vote based on individual interests, your bottom line, your income, your situation. Can you pay the bills? Are you making the money that you'd like to make or that you need to make? So on and so forth. Number two, sociotropic voting. This is voting based on an assessment of the economy at large. It could be that you do care about your individual interests, but you also pay attention to the economy at large because you believe that a growing economy will ultimately be better for you, even if you're still able to grow your own income in either situation. So maybe sociotropic voting is what drives you and you pay attention to the big picture. Prospective voting is the third type, and this is where you vote based on expected future trends. And you're thinking not about the past or what you can deduce from what you know already, but you're thinking about what you expect to happen based on what has happened. And so you're not necessarily punishing or rewarding, but you're voting based on a forecast or an outlook that you think is consistent with how reality will actually unfold. But what you'll notice about all three of these is that they highlight the rationality of the voter and the capacity of the voter to obtain information, to assess information, to make decisions in light of that information, and then to execute those decisions to support or oppose candidates or parties based on their assessment of their economic situation or the country's situation or the future. And so there's an important role for rational choice and for the rationality of choice. This is a literature and a theory that puts a great deal of emphasis on that rationality and really has confidence in ordinary voters. But there's also disagreement about what exactly is happening when voters engage in economic voting. What are they doing when they're economically voting or voting economically? Are they penalizing or rewarding the party for what it did in the past, whether that was something that affected their bottom line or affected the country at large? Or are they selecting the party they expect to perform best in the future based upon an assessment of the past? This does sort of align with some of those different types of economic voting that I just presented to you. But in the literature, these are two different types of models that have been proposed. Of the models of economic voting that we have, they take either the sanctioning view or the selection view. And so they make fundamental assumptions about whether, as rational voters, we are looking back or we are looking forward. And this is a fundamental disagreement. It's not possible to reconcile those two. It may be that voters make an assessment based upon both to some degree, but it's probably the case that ultimately they're either more so looking back and sanctioning or more so looking forward and selecting. And then the question becomes, what does that say about political behavior and about the rationality of behavior in the vote, in the economic vote? Is rewarding a party for what it did more likely to enhance your bottom line, or is penalizing a party more likely to do so? Is selecting among alternative teams a better strategy? What are voters actually doing when they're behaving instrumentally and either punishing or penalizing or rewarding leaders or parties. I'm going to pause here and I'm going to give you a chance to absorb this and think about this for a moment and consider the different examples that we saw. And in a moment, I will pick up again, but I'm going to consider some of the input in the chat and see where we are. Christopher says, businesses always want to pass the buck to consumers, workers, or the government with only their interest at heart. That we need to lay people off stuff was fought in California with pay cuts in many unions to keep workers until pay cuts would be restored. Unions were at the Capitol for the better part of a decade to restore time, not all cuts. They need unions everywhere for collective bargaining. So these are fundamentally different views of economic voting. Are voters sanctioning or are they selecting? And this is a question I might pose to you. And I might ask you, maybe in your own experience, perhaps if you think that you yourself have engaged in economic voting, are you voting based upon a penalty or a reward for something that was done in the past, or are you voting based upon an expectation about what might happen in the future? I think I know what my answer is, but I'm curious what the rest of you all think.
Professor, can you repeat the question again? Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. Sorry, I didn't actually have this written down, so I know that it's a little off the cuff. My question is just, if you've ever done or engaged in economic voting, did you feel like you were sanctioning a party or a leader, or were you selecting a party or a leader? Were you behaving based on the past, or were you behaving based on an expectation about the future? A lot of us are saying consider both, but there is also sort of a bent towards the selection view. It looks like many of you are sort of thinking in terms of selection. I kind of am too. And the reason I think that we might ultimately be selecting is because when you punish or reward a party or a leader for what they did in the past, you're also sort of rendering a judgment about what you might expect them to do in the future, right? So if you're punishing them, well, you might also be trying to vote them out because you don't think they'll behave well in the future. And you might simultaneously be rewarding or sort of selecting the alternative that you think will do what you expect them to do in the future. And so I think that selection is ultimately part of sanctioning as well. I think that it's sort of embedded in the act of sanctioning. But that's my tendency to sort of have this forward thinking perspective. And it looks like many of you also have that tendency too, although some of you are saying both. Some of you did say sanctioning. Claudia says, I think in the general elections, I definitely engage in selection. In primaries, I definitely use sanctioning, especially with establishment candidates. Touche. This is good. I'm really happy to hear that Claudia is pointing out that, look, it might depend on the circumstances. That sort of gets to my question from before. Like, when are we economically voting and when aren't we? And when are we using certain types of economic voting and when aren't we? And so when you're voting in primaries, you're definitely sanctioning, right? You're trying to, I mean, we often are. Maybe you're rewarding a candidate you like, maybe you're punishing a candidate you like, but you're definitely thinking about what they did in the past. But maybe in the generals, once that ship has sailed, maybe then you're making a choice based on what you anticipate to happen in the future. In which case there would be sort of a sophisticated role for assessment and awareness of your circumstances, right? It paints a picture of a voter who's relatively informed and strategic and thoughtful and careful about when to sanction and when to selection. Arja says, I think the pandemic and reaction to the pandemic and the economic outcome after it makes me think that it was sanctioning. Yeah, absolutely, right? At the same time, we could say that in addition to it being a sanction or a punishment for the incumbent, it was also sort of maybe a judgment or an endorsement of the alternative, at least to the extent that it wasn't the incumbent, right? So I guess it's that age-old question. You know, did you vote for this person because of who they were, because they weren't the alternative? And I think that that's what we're sort of getting at here. Are we sanctioning or are we selecting? Ishan says, I think in the general, the way that the incumbent has managed the economy plays a key role in whether I would vote for them or not. So sort of sanctioning in the general. However, I think it is interesting to note that the way that partisanship can change the way that people look at economic data. Yeah, so Ishan's getting at an important point, which we'll address here in a moment, which is the rationality of the voter and the actual ability of the voter or the capacity of the voter to be fully and accurately informed and to be assessing that information correctly. These are assumptions that are baked into the economic voting model, the theory of economic voting. This assumption that voters are informed, that they are very able to use the information at their disposal, that they are calculating and timely, and that they're not prone to mistakes or error. Now, these are obviously unreasonable assumptions. And the rational choice theorists among us will say, well, of course they're unreasonable. We're just trying to create a model of human behavior. But that's the problem. It's a model of human behavior, right? It's supposed to be relatively consistent with human behavior. As Ishan points out, there might be some limits to rationality. Our perception of something might rule more than the actual reality of it. And information can be easily distorted and misunderstood, and we might not be fully informed in the first place. But the general question of the rationality of economic voting is the question of just how rational and fully informed and calculating voters actually are. You know, is it true that they use information or expectations about party performance in office to vote? Are they basing their decision based upon this in a truly systematic and undiluted way? Is the information available to them reliable? Is it salient to them? Is it understood and processed? Is it complete? These are questions that sort of implicate the core assumptions of economic voting. And they may draw into question rationality and the rationality of choice. It may be that we're not that rational at all, and that economic voting might be something else in disguise. Maybe we are actually truly rational and we're able to make decisions, but within the sort of boundaries of what we might call a bounded rationality, or one that is rational to the extent that we correctly evaluate all of the information available to us. Then the question becomes, what are the boundaries of that rationality and how enabling or constraining are they? These are some of the fundamental questions about economic voting. But one thing is for sure, if we accept economic voting and the theory of economic voting, we are endorsing a view of the voter as quite rational and quite informed and quite knowledgeable and calculating and shrewd and capable of deciding based upon the information available to them what is best for them, and not just what is best for them, but correctly so, because that is what the theory requires. It requires that rigidity. And those are, of course, questions, but these are the issues involved in economic voting. And so we arrive then at this sort of crescendo where we are celebrating the sophistication and the nuance of the voter in the information available to them and their rationality, in their shrewd, calculating nature. But we might also wonder when they are more or less calculating or more or less rational. Could it be that they are less prone to economic voting under some circumstances and more prone to economic voting under other circumstances? Could it be that only when we are in a recession or a crisis does economic voting become paramount? Could it be that security considerations or issues of law and order can help to sort of rescue an incumbent president or prime minister who's not popular because of poor economic performance? These are all questions that we will engage with a little bit more on Friday. And we're going to do so by exploring some of the methods and approaches that are useful and that could be useful to study economic voting. And we'll engage with the Harding article, as well as talk about some different questions and issues that arise in the study of economic voting. And so thank you very much, everybody, for being here as always. And I always appreciate and benefit from your contributions, as do all of us. And so thanks a great deal. And that does wrap up the lecture for today. I'll see you on Friday.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Professor.